It is now 9 p.m. here in Israel. Yes, 9 p.m. here in Israel, 2 p.m. on the East Coast of the United States, and we are ready to begin our Zoom briefing for Haaretz.com. Thank you very much for joining us. This is a special briefing for Haaretz readers and subscribers on Israel, American Jews, and the Trump-Biden election. Thank you for being with us. Dramatic days to talk about this issue. Donald Trump, as I assume all of our viewers know, was released from the hospital yesterday after 72 hours of intensive treatment for COVID-19. Joe Biden is currently leading with a pretty stable lead in most of the polls, and the US presidential election is less than a month away. What would a Biden victory mean for Israel? How would a second Trump term impact the Middle East? And will the crazy events of the past week, the revelations about Trump's tax evasion, the presidential debate, maybe some of our viewers remember that event happening many years ago, and Trump's hospitalization, how will all those events change the course of the election? To discuss all of these questions and more, we are joined today by senior Haaretz columnist Chemi Shalev. Chemi, you can wave to the viewers. And by senior Haaretz reporter Ellison Kaplan-Sommer. Ellison, can you also say hi?
Hi, everyone.
Great. Both Chemi and Ellison have extensive experience covering American elections, Israeli politics, and the junctions where those two events intersect with each other. And today we will use their expertise to try and get a better understanding of where things stand in the Trump-Biden election, what we should expect next, and what all of it would mean for Israel and the American Jewish community. I'm Amir Tibon. I will be moderating the conversation today. I just want to note that towards the end of the hour, Chemi and Ellison will also answer some questions from you, our viewers. So please feel free to send us questions in writing through the Q&A feature on your Zoom screen. I will read those questions and then present some of them, the good ones, to our distinguished panelists at the end of the discussion. You can also watch us on Facebook Live. And again, thank you for being with us. A lot is going on in the world right now, so let's jump right into the news of the day. Chemi, I want to start with you. You covered the 2016 election on the ground in the United States. You were the Haaretz envoy in New York at the time. And we all remember that around this time, in 2016, Hillary Clinton enjoyed a big lead in the polls. Not as large as Joe Biden's current lead, but still a substantial one. And then a lot of things happened, and eventually Donald Trump won the Electoral College. When you look at all the data and all the information and all the news that we have in front of us today, do you also feel that many people are feeling that we might be reliving that experience from 4 years ago?
There's definitely a general fear of anyone who deals in politics or watches politics ignoring the 2016 experience. But I looked up the statistics today. For example, in the polls about the general results between Trump and Clinton, the last average was 3.2. The result was 2.1, which is actually a very good result. The mistakes came in the battleground states. But if you compare the situation today to the parallel situation in 2016, you'll see that, first of all, on the national average, Biden has twice as big an average as Clinton had at the time. And if you look at the battleground states were all over the place. There were states that were being called for Trump that eventually wound up going to Clinton, and vice versa. Right now, if you look at the polls, just the polls released today, if they are mistaken, it means that there's no point in doing any more polls, because, for example, there are two polls today on a national level that Biden leads Trump by 16%. So let's say the polls are mistaken by 4%, it's still a landslide. In order for it for the race to be close or to be considered close, Trump has to get, first of all, the national average down to around 5 to 6%. You know that. And as long as we don't reach that level, unless we were traumatized by 2016, we would say that if elections were held today, Biden would certainly win. I mean, no one would have a doubt. However, first of all, we've still got 28 or 9 days, and we're dealing with Donald Trump, who can pack decades of events into single hours. And like you said, you can't remember what happened yesterday, even though it could have been some cataclysmic historic event. And therefore, Biden is on course to win, but that course, there can be many obstacles in the course, and he could go off course. And don't forget, this election has all been about Trump. Biden has sort of gotten by maintaining a low profile and not saying things very controversial unless they escaped against his will. But if Biden has yet to make the major mistake that people, or at least his opponents, are waiting for, if he makes it, maybe it'll change the dynamics. And this is the last thing I'll say. The thing with Trump is that if you look at the last week, he is constantly making the situation worse. He may think he's making it better, and his fans cheer him on, for example, after the debate. But any objective observer knew that the debate only did him harm. I think the same is true of his exit from the hospital. And if he keeps on going this way, I don't think there'll be any question soon about who will win the elections.
Interesting. Ellison, do you share Chemi's assessment about the current state of the race? Are we living again through 2016? Or maybe this could end up being more like 2018, where the polls also in the battleground states mostly were correct. They showed a big shift towards the Democrats, and except maybe in the case of Florida, that's eventually what happened.
Well, as much as we pundits and journalists like to predict what's going to happen in the future based on our experiences in the past, I think we really have to hold ourselves back when it comes to this unusual election and the crazy circumstances it's being held in. This is going to be an unprecedented level of people mailing their ballots in, of people voting early. So these factors are going to influence, the differences between polling and voting, I think, more than ever in the past. So we would all do well to keep an eye on the polls, but realize that it's going to be very, very different, I think, from both of those two experiences. If I had to choose between 2016, 2018, I think I would definitely go with 2018. If you have any faith, any tiny little scrap of faith left in polls after 2016, left whatsoever. I mean, as Chemi mentioned, the latest CNN poll just released has Biden ahead by 16 points. Also, just finally, regarding the mistakes of the past, there's a very useful chart that the New York Times is maintaining with state-by-state polling, and then calculating what would happen if the mistakes in the polls are as large this year as they were in 2016. And even taking those potential mistakes into account right now, we've got all these battleground states, Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, all going to Biden, even if there is as large a mistake this year as there were in 2016. He even squeaks by in Florida, which is interesting for us at Haaretz, because that's probably one of the few states in which the Jewish vote plays an actual role. And remember, even those polls before Trump went to the hospital with COVID, it doesn't the tax story feels like a million years ago, apropos of Chemi's comment of Trump letting the event sort of roll ahead. Even before that, Biden was ahead by 9 points. And that was those polls were reflecting on his performance in the debate. So again, I think that if we had to choose, we would rely on the 2018 polling, reflecting a clear victory on Biden's part. But this is an unusual, to put it mildly, year, and I think that it's very hard to judge what will happen based on what we've known before.
What I hear from both of your comments is that this could be the end of Donald Trump, or it could be the end of polling in politics. One of the two. Chemi, I want to focus more specifically now on the Jewish vote. We published a poll last month showing that Joe Biden was getting around 70% of the Jewish vote in the election. Again, this is one pretty large sample poll, but just one poll, giving Biden around 70% of the Jewish vote and Trump 30%. And what was surprising to me is that after we published the poll, both sides, the Trump campaign and the Biden campaign, spun it as some kind of a great victory and a sign that they are, on the right track. Can both of them be right? Can this kind of result actually be good for both candidates?
I think both sides were relieved. I think, for example, Biden had apprehensions about the influence of Trump's pro-Israel policies on the one hand, and the radical, supposedly anti-Israel wing in the Democratic Party on the other hand. And he was relieved to see that he's polling more or less about the average Democratic vote, and in fact higher than the 65 or 64% that Obama got in 2012. I think, on the other hand, the Republicans must have dreaded, they know that the community is against, as a whole, is against Trump. He's made comments, even in the past month, that have been interpreted as anti-Semitic. The Jews, generally speaking, don't like him. And I'm sure he was relieved to see, actually 30%, I think, is higher than their own estimates. Their own estimates were at around 25. So from their point of view, if there's a poll that shows him polling at 30%, they're happy. And it may even pump them up to go through this ritual that we go through every 4 years, where the Republicans come and say, this year everything's going to change and the Jews are going to come vote. And then we wind up more or less with the same numbers. And my assumption is that we will wind up with these numbers. I would be surprised, by the way, if Trump really pulls 30%. That would surprise me, even though he's got a solid base of support. But 30% means that he's catching votes beyond that base, and that's a bit surprising.
Yeah, 30 would be more than he got last time. But I also want to ask you, Chemi, if we're already opening this conversation, does the Jewish vote even matter? We're looking at a national election with something like 10, battleground, purplish states that determine the result. And we at Haaretz, of course, love to write about the Jewish vote and these kinds of polls and analysis. Does it even matter in an election like 2020?
Well, first of all, it matters, as we all know, in Florida, which has a large Jewish population, which I think, and also, by the way, a large Israeli expat population inside, who I think tend rightwards. They're like the Cuban Hispanics in Florida. They tend rightwards, unlike the rest of the community. So that is really the only place where they could have a major impact. But if it's not in the cards right now, but if you had a very close race in Pennsylvania, if you had a very close race in Ohio, maybe even in Michigan, in places like this, if it's really rather thin, then the Jews would make a difference. Otherwise, I think it's mostly important to the Jews. It's sort of every 4 years, they get a picture of where they are, and usually the picture is that they're in the same place they were 4 years ago.
Yeah, at least one thing stays the same with all the craziness around us that keeps shifting and changing around. It's the 70-30 kind of dynamic. Alison, one story that we had this week that in normal times would probably become actually a pretty big scandal, but among the insane headlines of the past week, didn't get a lot of attention, was this attack by the American ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, on Joe Biden, where he basically said that Biden supposedly would be good for Iran and so forth. Who is David Friedman speaking to when he is making this kind of very undiplomatic attack on Joe Biden and interfering directly in the political scene? Is this aimed at Jewish voters, or is there another crowd that he's trying to reach here?
Well, literally, he said it to the United Arab Emirates, because that quote was taken from an interview on the United Arab Emirates television interview. So presumably, I don't think there's too many UAE voters in the United States. I don't know how voter directed it is. Perhaps there are donors who very much care about the interests of the Gulf states, as well as the donors who.
It's not a big diaspora, you're saying.
Yeah.
Diaspora.
Exactly. So, the background is that, as we know, President Trump withdrew from the Obama-led Iran deal, and Iran no longer had any path to relief from harsh sanctions about their nuclear program. And the Trump administration has been very tough on sanctions since. And you can't deny that this is a good issue for Trump's people to press on and to hold on to, because there are people, beyond the hard Trump base in the right-wing Jewish community and the evangelical pro-Trump community, on which the Iran issue is one in which they hesitate to side with the Democrats. Biden has said that he would return to the negotiating table, return to the deal. The quote is that he will offer Tehran a credible path back to diplomacy. If Iran returns to strict compliance with the nuclear deal, the U.S. would rejoin the agreement as a starting point for negotiations. Now, he says at the same time that, he's unshakably against Iran getting nuclear weapons. But as you said, in the current craziness, it's just a footnote. The fact that Ambassador Friedman stomped on any rules or regulations or guidelines or norms. Sitting U.S. ambassadors are not supposed to go campaign for the president, but since when has the Trump administration really cared about playing by the rules? But as I said, if you discount the messenger being Friedman, it is a pretty effective campaign message signal to send to people who worry about Iran, be they Gulf states or be they American Jews.
And a follow-up question on that, does Biden have any prominent surrogates in the Jewish community, in pro-Israeli circles, that can help him push back against this kind of line? Because it is unusual to have a candidate attacked by the ambassador to Israel, questioning his record on Israel. How is Biden pushing back on that?
Well, I haven't seen too many people pushing back, but as we know, in the past week, in the craziness,
there's been some stuff going on, yeah.
Things going on, and nobody's really been talking foreign policy, for however long. And can you remember the last foreign policy debate in this campaign? The natural surrogate to push back on this would be obviously the Biden campaign's man on the Middle East, former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Dan Shapiro. Now, Ambassador Shapiro is sitting in Israel right now. He works as a think tank. He works as a commentator in the Israeli media, and he seems to have made it kind of a personal guideline not to criticize his successor. I haven't seen him in any way directly attack David Friedman, so I think kind of the natural surrogate to push back on this is keeping quiet. I did see a piece by Heather Stone, who's the head of Democrats abroad in Israel, and she accused Friedman of fear-mongering, and she argued that Iran is closer to a nuclear breakout today than it was when Trump took office, and that she attacked the tacit agreement by the United States to sell F-35 planes to the UAE in exchange or in tandem with the agreement with Israel, saying that Trump has sort of dismissed the concept of Israel's qualitative edge. So she's pushed back, but I haven't seen a lot of high-profile surrogates the same in the United States.
Well, it's true that there's been more discussion about what's happening at Walter Reed Hospital this week in the Middle East. I just want to remind all of our viewers that you can send us questions via the Q&A feature. And we are already getting some questions even related to this topic. We have one viewer commenting that this actually is more aimed at the evangelical vote than the Jewish vote. And Chemi, I want to ask you about that. You wrote an article yesterday, great article that we read on Haaretz.com, detailing how a Biden presidency could play out in the Jewish community and the pro-Israel circles, who would lose access to the White House, who would be back in the game, how it would impact the evangelical organizations, AIPAC, J Street. Can you share the main thesis of the article with the viewers for those who haven't read it?
Well, we have a completely new situation in the, say, the power structure of the pro-Israel community in Washington, which is a direct function of the polarization and of the fact that there really is no center anymore or bipartisanship. There's very little bipartisanship. And because Trump has no regard for, establishment traditions or rules, first of all, he sort of has ignored the Jewish establishment as we knew it, which, from his point of view, is mainly AIPAC. He brought in new players, for example, the Zionist Organization of America and the Republican Jewish Committee, many of whom are linked in one way to another to the man with the purse strings, which is Sheldon Adelson, who we know has the president's ear. He's the GOP's biggest donor. He was the Trump's campaign biggest donor. And so the AIPAC, which used to be sort of as solid as a rock, no matter who the president was, found itself, for a variety of reasons, a lot of them having to do with the Iran nuclear deal. But in any case, it found itself on the sidelines, not completely irrelevant, but on the sidelines. And if there is a Biden victory, and we have to differentiate here between a Biden victory, which keeps the Senate for the GOP, and one in which, in any case, we're going, for the first time, I think ever, the entire structure will be replaced. We'll have a coup d'etat where all the people who are now influential in, have the president's ear and are influential in determining US policy towards Israel, including and foremost among them, the evangelicals, will have very little influence, if at all, in a Biden administration. Instead, AIPAC will be back, conditionally back, because it still has to, I think, repair its relationship, not only with the Democratic Party as a whole, but some of the key figures in Trump's foreign policy team are people that dealt with the Iran nuclear deal.
In Biden's foreign
Biden's,
policy.
And they have very bitter memories of what they were told by AIPAC and how they were described by AIPAC, and how the Iran deal was described as an existential threat, and so on. And we have a new player on the block, which is J Street. And I say new because J Street was established in 2007. And in the 8 Obama years, the 8 years of Obama, it was sort of an upstart, a surly teen that got on AIPAC's nerves, and it tried to, but things are different now. First of all, AIPAC isn't AIPAC, as I said. And also J Street has cultivated relationships with a lot of the moderate Democrats. And I think more importantly, if you really look at their core positions, the core position of J Street, which is a two-state solution without any reservations, compared to AIPAC, which is a two-state solution, but more or less in Bibi style, which is how do you define a state and whether it's a state at all, is much closer, the J Street vision is much closer to what most Democrats, and I think most people in the Biden administration, will adhere to. So AIPAC is going to have to, one, ingratiate itself with the Biden administration, and two, it'll have to make a strategic decision what its relationship will be with J Street. And that will be a function, I think, of what its relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu will be. Benjamin Netanyahu is the man responsible for shunting AIPAC aside. He's the one who made the strategic decision to rely mostly on the evangelicals and on Sheldon Adelson. I don't think AIPAC will refuse him, but that's also problematic, because even those Democratic, I think probably the majority of Democratic lawmakers support Israel and definitely support its right to exist. But I forgot what I was going to say. What was I talking about?
We were talking about, what
Yeah.
AIPAC between Netanyahu and Biden.
Right. For them, they don't want to hear about Netanyahu. AIPAC, if it becomes Netanyahu's advocate, they will have a problem with their client, selling their client to their crowd. And then just one more comment. There's a big difference between whether the Senate is Republican or Democrat in a Biden administration. If the Senate is Republican, first of all, that gives Bibi some kind of leeway. And it also forces him to maintain relationships, not only with the AIPAC, but also with, to maintain the structure that he has now. If, on the other hand, the Senate is Democrat, and Bibi really has no influence. He's almost a persona non grata in some parts, not in the White House, but in some parts of the House and the Senate and some of the White House. That is a completely different situation. In that situation, he'll need AIPAC much more, and J Street will be more influential. Mm-hmm. But overall, I was just stating the obvious, that we no longer have a permanent Jewish pro-Israel establishment that is in Washington, no matter who the president is. And if things continue this way, then I think it will just, we'll see if a president goes, the whole Jewish establishment goes with him, and then an alternate establishment comes in.
Ellison, on the same subject, it did seem, though, earlier this year, that when Biden began to, catch one victory after the other in the Democratic primary, AIPAC and the other Jewish American establishment organizations that are more kind of in the center right, I would say, on Israel at least, did seem to be relieved, because the alternative that they were fearing was Bernie Sanders. Right. And we've seen throughout the campaign attempts by the Trump campaign to really connect Sanders and Biden on policy issues, including on Israel. But there was a reason why it seemed like, the affiliates of AIPAC did prefer Biden, right? I mean, there is a gap between them, and the Democratic Party is not united on this issue today.
Well, yeah, first of all, I mean, even when we had the initial wide Democratic field, it was clear
that 24 candidates. Remember those days?
It was clear that Biden was front and center in terms of who the traditional pro-Israel lobby was comfortable with, despite the fact that he was Obama's vice president and they had their issues with him. But Biden's relationship with the Israel advocacy community in AIPAC goes long before anyone knew who Barack Obama was. So it was very clear that he was their ideal choice from the beginning, even though they obviously cultivated relationships with all the other candidates. Now, there's clearly, not just on Israel, on a wide range of issues, been much more work behind the scenes between the Biden campaign and the so-called progressive left/squad part of the party than happened in 2016, where there was much more public bomb throwing, to coin a phrase, by the left onto the more mainstream candidate. And it looks like there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of negotiation as to how far Biden will move towards the progressive positions, and in exchange, the progressive wing of the party is going to get on board and not publicly slam Biden for not perfectly matching up with their positions. Now, there's a contrast from what I see between how that dynamic has worked in terms of the most important domestic issues like healthcare, like the environment, et cetera, in which you've seen a real shift in Biden towards the left. And the issue of Israel and the Palestinians, where really it doesn't seem like he's given an inch towards the progressive camp. The Democratic platform, the far left conceded without much of a fight in terms of very traditionally pro-Israel language. Calling for the two-state solution, the importance of U.S. military aid to Israel, recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. And it was so kind of extreme in that way that the Palestinians complained that it falls short of being fair and just. So the Trump campaign hasn't had a lot of ammunition to use against Biden in saying, oh, he's caving to the far left. Every time they have the smallest opportunity, whether it's Linda Sarsour appearing for a minute on one of the videos in the Democratic National Convention, or the recently Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez pulling out of a Peace Now event on Rabin, the right wing and the Republicans are jumping on it because it's the only opportunity they have, because there's really no clear, blatant evidence that Biden has at all conceded to that camp when it comes to his campaign's position on Israel. And the position on the progressive left seems to be now, let's pull together, let's let Biden win, and we'll take up our battles with him later on. So most of the action happened during the primaries, not much action during this general election in terms of that tension.
Yeah, and it reminds me of an article you published at the time, Alison, after the convention, where you wrote that basically on many issues, the Democratic Party has moved left, but on Israel, it's still Joe Biden's party right now, not Bernie Sanders. Chemi, I want to shift this to a different political figure that you mentioned earlier, Benjamin Netanyahu. Is there any doubt in your mind that he's rooting for a Donald Trump victory? And if he doesn't get his way, and if it's Biden, how would that affect his personal fate with all of the political turmoil in Israel and the legal troubles, etc.?
I don't have any doubt that Netanyahu is praying for a Trump victory. I've heard versions, other versions, different versions, but I am convinced these have been the best 4 years of his life. In terms of US-Israeli relations. Netanyahu spent most of his career. In his first term, he had to fight with Clinton. And from 2009, he had a massive brawl with Obama. And for the first time, not only did he get a president that he gets along with, he more or less got a president that gives him anything he wants. And so I don't think I have a doubt. I think that also for Netanyahu, the prospect of a Biden administration and a Congress controlled by both houses of Congress controlled by the Democrats is a kind of nightmare. Now, how does that directly affect Israel? First of all, or Netanyahu? First of all, I don't know how, we have 3 months of transition on the assumption that there is going to be a transition. First of all, I don't think that Israel and the Middle East is a top priority for Biden. And I think that he made clear in the talks that Alison mentioned with the progressive wings, they sort of divided up the world. I'll give you stuff on domestic policy, leave me alone on foreign policy. But I think his main purpose in foreign policy will be to shore up the alliances that Trump ruined. And to recalibrate foreign policy. I don't think especially if there's if there's no violence or anything, I don't think he's going to be thinking about us in the first 2 years. Look, Netanyahu embraced Trump so strongly that Trump is now part of Netanyahu's political persona. I will remind you that in all of the, 70,000 elections that we've had in the past 2 years, one of the main selling points that Netanyahu has been showing is his relation. We've had these massive posters over highways. So Trump is part of Netanyahu's persona, part of his advantage. People, I think, give him a lot of credit for getting into this position where he's the best friend of the President of the United States. So if Trump loses, there'll be questions whether he invested too heavily in Trump and now has to face the wrath of Democrats. So that will hurt his prestige. The question that I don't know is whether there will be the beginning of any sort of criticism of anything that we haven't heard from, Trump never criticized Netanyahu or Israel for anything. Will we start to hear that? I think the more that it seems that Netanyahu is headed for a clash with Biden, the more it will hurt. And I say that, I wouldn't necessarily have said that 2 years ago even, because 2 years ago, everybody have said, even if it's Biden, Netanyahu still is the most consummate professional and he'll know how to deal with him. But given that Netanyahu is in trouble anyway, and the trouble is getting deeper by the day, because of his mismanagement of the coronavirus epidemic and the economic, I think this will be sort of another weight on his shoulder, which is already deterring him from going to elections. He will not have, as he had in all of these elections, he will not have a US president at his back, providing all sorts of, presenting the deal of the century, making peace all over the place. He won't have those things. He might even have an administration that will make clear to the Israeli people that they'd really prefer somebody else to be prime minister. So the US is so important for Israel and for Netanyahu that such a dramatic change cannot but have an effect on his position.
Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is that most of the impact would be political for Netanyahu, not necessarily on the actual policy front, because that's not going to be a big priority for Biden. But he's not going to get a speech at the White House 2 weeks before the election to, the Israeli election, to kind of present himself as the man who brings Israelis' achievements from Washington.
Yeah. I don't think. Look, objectively speaking, Israel is not a top priority for the United States in the sense that there is no burning issue to resolve here, whereas there are all sorts of hotspots that Trump will leave any Democratic administration, from North Korea to Russia to China. There's hardly any place. There's no
COVID,
climate change.
Yeah.
I don't believe that apocalyptic predictions, suddenly there's going to be US pressure and everything's going to change. The tone will change. I think it'll take a while before the substance changes.
Interesting. Ellison, how much does the result of this election matter for the opposition in Israel, the center-left parties that amazingly won a majority of seats in 2 of the 3 recent elections, but then failed to act like adults and form a government without Netanyahu? Do they have anything at stake in the Trump-Biden competition?
Well, Amir, to be perfectly frank, if they had their act together, then they might have something at stake. But they have so many bigger problems right now, so many deep, fundamental, existential problems now in Israel's so-called center/center-left. Some of them are in Netanyahu's government. Some of them are out of Netanyahu's government. They're struggling to figure out how to deal with the popular opposition to Netanyahu's handling of the coronavirus crisis, and whether that they can somehow use it to leverage themselves back in power. Anyway, it's hard to believe that they have much bandwidth for this U.S. election. In a theoretical world where there was some clear leadership of the Israeli center-left camp, they would definitely have an argument that after Netanyahu's display of deep partisanship on the U.S. front, that a potential Biden White House, Biden State Department, and Benjamin Netanyahu could be really disastrous for Israel, because the foreign policy staff would surely be made up of Obama veterans who have a lot of bad blood with Netanyahu specifically. That would be an excellent argument for political change. But as I said, they've got bigger problems to deal with right now. They're not offering any kind of leadership figure that can be rallied around now. And frankly, the Netanyahu alternative that everyone's pointing to comes from the right, not from the left. So in a theoretical world, yes, there would definitely be an argument, but that's not the reality we're living in right now.
Yeah. Amir, let me make just one more point. Trump is a yardstick by which Israelis measure Netanyahu's more outrageous behavior. So when Netanyahu attacks the rule of law, says that demonstrators are spreading diseases, whatever Netanyahu does, even if it's imported from Trump directly, which happens, it's always a notch or 2 less than Trump. And it makes Netanyahu seem, relatively speaking, less extreme than Trump. And as long as he's less extreme than Trump, it works in his favor. Also, Trump creates, first of all, an air of inevitability about right-wing populists on the ascendant and liberal Democrats, on their way out. And he also influences Trump. Trump is not supported in Israel only because he is a pro-Israel president. He is supported in Israel because a lot of his behavior, unfortunately, first of all, is much more Israeli than American. When I saw him at the debate, I thought, well, yeah, that's a typical Israeli politician.
All the interruptions and being smarter than the moderate, and
then I saw Americans so appalled, and for us, it was just run of the
regular behavior.
Right, and so it's like as if he gives dispensation for people to be against democracy, against the press, against the courts, against whatever you want. if we had back a Democratic administration, and especially one which every once in a while, as Obama did, sort of raps Israel on the knuckles over this or that, I think it would help in getting the Israeli public back to, say, democratic normalcy.
Interesting point. We have 20 minutes left, and we do want to take questions from the viewers. We're getting a lot of great questions. It's actually going to be tough to choose. But before we go there, Chemi, let's talk briefly about another aspect of the election that is just as important as the presidential election, but is not getting the same amount of attention, which is the fight for control of the Senate. We heard Majority Leader Mitch McConnell say just the other day that basically, in his view, the control of the Senate currently is a coin flip. 50-50 could go either way. What's your assessment on where this stands? And could there be any significant impact for Israel in the Middle East beyond, political stuff for Netanyahu, something that is more strategic if it goes this way or the other way?
Look, first of all, I'm reading the polls that came out today. And if you put the polls that came out today about the Senate races with the polls that came out today about the national race, I think it's quite probable, if not more than that, that a Biden victory most likely will result in a Democratic takeover of the Senate. A while ago, Nate Silver did a computation, and this was when Biden's polls were not as good as they are today. And he said if Biden wins, the Democrats have an 83% chance of taking over the Senate. And if Trump wins, they only have a 17% chance of winning the Senate. So once you know the results of the presidential election, you'll be able to gauge the Senate elections. And if you look at the polls today, there are about 10 open battles over seats held by Republicans. Only 1.5, Michigan and Alabama, I think, that the Democrats may lose. And so in all probability, it seems as if the Democrats, on the assumption that we don't have big surprises, will take over the Senate. I can't, first of all, if there's some international treaty that comes up and the Senate has to approve it, then we might see a repeat of the, Iran deal. But otherwise, I don't see that the Senate specifically is of great importance to Israel. But as we said before, if we have a Democratic sweep and there are no pockets of Republican resistance that Netanyahu, say, can muster, his position becomes much more vulnerable. He's much more exposed, and he's going to need more help in order to try to offset not so much the administration, but the many people in both houses that have it in for him. So from that point of view, it does make a difference. Also, there are two interesting Jews that are,
We're always interested in interesting Jews.
And the ones the ones that I'm following is one, the 32-year-old investigative journalist from Georgia, John Ossoff, who was suddenly neck and neck with, I think, David Perdue.
Yes.
And more interestingly is the, I think he's an orthopedic surgeon, Al Gross from Alaska, whose main claim to fame and the main point of his campaign is that he killed a bear in a few years ago that attacked him. And really, I mean, this is just an aside. I was surprised at myself that I had not heard his father was the Attorney General of Alaska from 1974 to 1980. He was considered a very successful Attorney General. He was sort of a hippie that came to live in Alaska. And throughout his service, his name was Avrum Gross. Now you tell me who would have believed that in Alaska there would be an Attorney General called Avrum Gross, but it's a fact.
Yeah, that's one of the fun things in American elections. You can actually go into the local races and get these amazing stories. And Alison, you are joining us right now from the US, and we hope that we will read some interesting stories from you later about the races we have in Maine, for example, interesting Senate race, New Hampshire, which is going to be very, very competitive on the
I'm
presidential
in New
level.
England. I've got my New England Patriots mask.
Okay, so that would probably help your reporting in New Hampshire for sure. All right, friends, it's been fascinating 45 minutes. Thank you both very, very much for all the interesting points you've made. And now let's move to questions from the readers. Like I said, we got a ton of interesting questions. It's going to be a bit challenging to choose. I will start with a question from Stephen Portnoy. Ellison, you take on this one first. What is your thinking on the sale of the F-35s to the UAE? And do you think Netanyahu would try to work his way in Congress to maybe block the sale, which the Trump administration is interested, of course, in pursuing?
Well, on the surface, publicly, there's been no admission by Netanyahu that he made any kind of quiet, tacit agreement when working out the deal with the UAE, that he would not oppose these plane sales. Some Israeli reporters have reported otherwise, and it is surmised that this is something that would have been worked out beforehand on this. One would assume that Netanyahu has already made the calculation what is more important in the big picture to Israel, this kind of deal, this kind of agreement above the board, normalization and cooperation with the UAE, or the risks of having that sale go through. And it seems to me from all signals that that matter has already been decided by Netanyahu, and I would expect the sale to move ahead.
Thank you. We have a question from Shelley. I hope I'm reading this correct, Schrater. Israel's clear interest has always been to position itself as a bipartisan issue, but with the decline of bipartisanship in general in the United States, is there any chance of keeping that situation? Chemi, what's your take on that one?
I think Israel is in probably a good position to rebuild the bipartisan consensus about Israel. Once the Democrats win, and on the assumption that Israel can repair its relations with some of the Democrats at least, and certainly get along with the Biden administration, I think then that you could form sort of the previous coalition of centrist Democrats, centrist Republicans who support the mainstream policy with, sniping from both sides. If, on the other hand, Netanyahu goes the way, say the Senate remains Republican, and Netanyahu gets into trouble with the Biden administration, and he goes the way that he did in 2015 with the JCPOA, that could lead to a completely different dynamic. I think that would be a strategic mistake on his part, but he has made some of those. And it would also touch, I think, the most sensitive issue, the issue of Netanyahu's relationship or attitude towards Democratic presidents is very sensitive, as we know. It's not as sensitive as it was under Obama, and I think Netanyahu will get along much better with Biden. But if there is a clash, Israel will have to make a decision whether it tries to work through the bipartisan consensus, in which case it will have to give in, or whether it works through, whatever influence it still has with Republicans, in which case it'll be headed for a collision course. It'll be on a collision course with a Biden administration. But I do think that contrary to a lot of other issues that America is hopelessly divided about, Israel, the bipartisan tradition which has eroded under Trump, I think can be rebuilt. Not perhaps to where it was, but certainly rebuilt to a solid situation.
Yeah, I will just add, it's an interesting question because we also don't know how Biden will govern. One of the main promises that he's making in his campaign is that if he's elected president, he will, in general, try to reconstitute bipartisanship in Washington. He keeps saying, some Democrats actually say hopelessly, naively, that if he gets elected, Republican senators will learn to work with him and put Trump behind, and that will be like in the good old days where senators could actually reach agreements. We'll see about that. But maybe that could also have an impact on where Israel stands. Another questions we have from Lori Palatnik. And I think this one gets to the heart of the agony that a lot of Jewish Americans who like Israel but don't like Trump are feeling. How can we balance the extreme pro-Israel Trump with the abhorrent, immoral person that he seems to be? Ellison and Chemi, I want both of you to try to stab this in a minute and a half, because it is a good question.
Is you can't an answer?
That would be short.
I mean, for people who Israel is their top #1 issue, for people who have watched what the Trump administration has done over the past 4 years and says, I absolutely 100% want a guarantee that there's going to be more of that policy, they want a sure thing in terms of Israel policy, then Trump is the person that they're going to vote for, because Biden is definitely going to be a question mark. There are no guarantees there. But if at the same time you believe that the qualities that Trump has displayed as a leader, or his competence or incompetence, let's put the moral question aside, but just his ability to quote unquote lead the free world, if that is more important to you than that single issue of Israel policy, then I would imagine that you would either vote for Biden or maybe even stay home.
Yeah, I mean, Israelis and most Israelis, and I think most Israeli Jews, American Jews, appreciate the recognition of Jerusalem, Golan Heights, and consider Trump to be a pro-Israel president. And they would like to assume that his pro-Israel policies are the result of some deep commitment to Israel and long thought out diplomatic discussions. And, but unfortunately, or fortunately or unfortunately, Israel just happened to win the lottery with Trump. His policies towards Israel, if you're not Israeli, if you look at them from Europe, and if you look at them from anywhere else in the world, his policies on Israel are just the same as his policies on anything else. They are unbalanced. They ignore the Palestinians, who are supported by most of the world. His fight against the UN, UNESCO, the World Health Organization, withdrawing from organizations because they are critical of Israel. For Israelis, that's great, and we support it, and we think, that's justice. But frankly, if you look at it from anywhere else in the world, you don't have to square the pro-Israel, the completely pro-Israel policies with Trump's attitude to everything else, because they're part of the same. Israel was very lucky that it had the evangelicals who were his base, and they had Sheldon Adelson, who was funding him, and they had Netanyahu, who knew how to cultivate him, and it paid off for Trump to be, or he thought it paid off for Trump to be pro-Israel, and that's the extent of it. It could have just as easily gone the other way.
Interesting. We have a question from Fatihos Turk. If Biden is elected, how will he look at the normalization process that Israel is having with the Arab and Muslim countries? Ellison, you want to take on that?
I don't see any reason why he wouldn't want to keep it going and promote it. And the question is whether someone who is not as clearly transactional as Trump is, who has sort of a background and comes from a party in which he is going to have to say something about human rights abuses in those countries and point out the negative, and who has a nuanced foreign policy, whether he can still keep that going and keep that momentum going and continue to have other Gulf countries or other Muslim countries normalize their relationship with Israel.
Yeah, it's notable that one of the only issues, I think, in the campaign where Biden said something good about something that Trump did was the UAE deal, where he came in favor of it and tried to kind of spin it to say that, that this was something that was already being under the work under Obama, etc.
Amir, I just want to add, it's not only that, of course, I agree completely with Ellison that Biden will have no reason to tamper or to retard the normalization process. But I think it's more than that. I think he might find that the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, they could be his allies. if he intends to say even just an economic initiative for the Palestinians, but certainly if he wants to get into the thick of a diplomatic process, and even if he just wants to curb Israel's behavior, Israel treasures now its relationship with these three countries, and their relationship with Biden, I assume, will be not as good as with Trump, but good. And I think he could actually use these countries in order to put leverage on Israel that he may not have had available to him otherwise.
But they'll be watching whatever he does on Iran very, very closely. And I think that will be a lot of what determines whether or not he can continue that dynamic of getting into their good graces enough and pressuring them on the Israel issue. I think it's all about Iran in the end.
Interesting. Okay, we have a question on a totally different subject from Chris Doyle about Trump's comments on issues relating to the Jewish community, saying that Jews who vote for the Democrats are not loyal, saying that there were good people among the Nazis in Charlottesville, and there was a recent report in the Washington Post that he said that Jews only stick to their own. How has that impacted the Jewish community in the United States? Does any of this play any role in how Trump is judged by the population in Israel?
Yeah, remember a really, really long time ago at the debate when he refused to condemn white supremacy?
That was ages ago. It was a huge headline for 2 days.
Yeah. Listen, I think that it hurts his cause. And, if anyone cares about the Jewish vote, in which there are members of the Jewish community who might otherwise be convincible on the basis of his relationship with Israel, who hear these things, and it makes it impossible for them to support him.
I think that, first of all, this sort of strengthens my point that one cannot differentiate between his pro-Israel policies and his otherwise, say, deplorable attitude towards minorities in general and Jews in particular. And I don't think there is any contradiction, in fact, between his support for Israel and his, let's say, unclear attitude towards Jews. I'm trying to put it mildly. I also, apropos the dual loyalty, Trump is surrounded by Jews, say, for example, David Friedman, who we spoke about, who openly profess that Israel is their top priority, that they are loyal to Israel, that the only thing they care about is Israel. And he doesn't really meet other kinds of Jews, and because they oppose him, and they don't even come from the same world as him. So from his point of view, a good Jew is a Jew that votes Trump and supports Israel, or maybe votes Trump because he supports Israel. And he can't understand what's going on. Who are these Jews who care about healthcare or equal rights or separation of church and state? He doesn't understand because he doesn't know really those kinds of Jews. Even the Jews that he grew up with in New York are not representative of the overall American Jewish community. They are East Side real estate machers mainly. A lot of them mostly vote Republican. Even in his past, he had very little contact with people who represent the American Jewish community. And they're alien to him. He doesn't understand what's going on. He can't understand how is it possible that he's such a good president for Israel and they still won't vote for him and are, in fact, are some of his top critics.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have heard before that, especially around the midterm elections, Trump was frustrated about the Jewish vote. That the midterm election took place after he announced the embassy move, after he withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, after he put a lot of pressure on the Palestinians. And the exit polling showed that the Jewish support for Democrats actually went higher than in 2016. More Jews voted for Democrats in the midterms than in the Trump-Clinton contest before all of those things happened. And he was very frustrated about this. We are reaching the end of the hour, 10 p.m. here in Israel, 3 p.m. on the East Coast. We will take one or two questions just because we do have great questions coming from people. And I want to thank everyone who joined and asked questions and made comments, and sometimes disagreed with us, or was maybe angry about something that was said. But thank you for watching and from being with us, and for sharing your questions and thoughts. One more question that I do want to have, it's from GB about Iran. How concerned should we be about the recent developments that are happening with Iran and the option of breakaway towards a nuclear bomb? Netanyahu has been talking about this for decades. Are we really so close as some people are saying now? Chemi, you want to answer quickly on that one?
Is Iran close, you mean? Look, I think that if Trump loses the elections, Netanyahu loses the end game of his complete Iran strategy. Because the end game of his Iran strategy was that either Iran would be brought to its knees by economic sanctions, or it would have to face US military threats, if not force, if it went ahead with its nuclear program. So Iran has not buckled. It's speeding ahead with its a nuclear program, at least according to Netanyahu. And in a month, he might have a lame duck administration, which perhaps could still continue the hawkish Trump attitude towards Iran. But from January, he won't have a partner anymore. And I, for one, who thought that leaving the persuading Trump to leave the JCPOA was a mistake, I'm afraid that we're going to be left with a policy that suddenly there's nobody to carry it out. And so that'll be a tough situation. I also don't know, maybe somebody else knows, how Iran will react to a Biden election. Will it decide that, okay, we're going to make right now and try to get back into the JCPOA, or will it come to the conclusion that it can continue to build its nuclear program, but at the same time weaken America's resolve to take it head on?
Okay. We really are past the hour, so one more last question before we wrap it up. I want to present this one to you, Alison. It's a theoretical but interesting question from David Rafael. If Biden wins, but then during his term something happens and he cannot complete his term, and Kamala Harris steps in as president, would she be a good president for Israel?
Ooh, there's a question.
And we gave you the toughest one for the end.
I mean, first of all, you have to remember this is a first-term senator. This isn't someone with some sort of, long track record in national politics. She built a reputation as a California politician. I suppose it's a little tribal to view the fact that her husband is Jewish as hopeful that she will view us with some sympathy and knowledge. Everything she's displayed has shown that she seems to be, slotted in the what so-called moderate Democrat category throughout her own primary campaign. She was constantly, it seemed, zigzagging between the progressive camp and the so-called moderate camp. And when it came to foreign policy, when it came to Israel issues, she was definitely not, a squad member. And she definitely seems to fit and slot into pretty much where Biden is today. So I would be pretty confident with her at the helm as far as Israel is concerned.
Closer to where Biden is than the more Sanders made the party.
During the primary campaign, she showed nothing to us that would suggest a sharp shift otherwise.
Interesting. Well, that is still a long time away, but Kamala Harris will be debating Mike Pence, Vice President Mike Pence, at the VP candidates debate tomorrow. I mean, I can't believe that it's already happening. And if you're interested in that, you should log to Haaretz.com and get a subscriber, get a subscription, of course, and get reader alerts, which is important for Alison and Chemi, so you can read what they will write after the vice presidential debate. And let's see, maybe there will also be some discussion of foreign policy, unlike the Trump-Biden debate, where there was barely a discussion of anything, but foreign policy for sure was not mentioned. Okay, we are 5 minutes past our time, so we will wrap it up now. I want to thank Chemi and Ellison for just a great hour, a lot of interesting observations and stories. And I want to thank everyone who joined us. As I already said, make sure to go to Haaretz.com, subscribe, and get writer alerts for Chemi and Ellison so you can keep reading all the great stuff that they write about Israeli politics and American politics and their intersection. We will have at least one more briefing session like this before the election actually happens. So, keep following and looking for the next one. Thanks for joining us. And most importantly, these days, stay safe and healthy. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.